2, verses 8 to 18. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality or family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil and myrrh, 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning, return with another part of the harem to the care of Shagez, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tabeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all the nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality.
The days are getting a little longer, aren't they? Air is starting to get a little warmer. The snow is all but just a few patches in the corners of our yards. Even some flowers are starting to poke through. We see that things are changing. The word Lent is actually traced etymologically back to an old English word called lengthen, which means to lengthen, referring to the length of the days. And from this, we get the season of spring. In a way, Lent is a recognition of the world itself turning on its axis, changing. And as that world dials into something new, we see that the long days of winter pass us by. We see that something has been at work over a long period of time, but we're only slowly now, as we round that corner, seeing what it was that has been worked on this whole time. Lent helps us put things into focus. Our theme for Lent this season is Rags to Riches. The theme explores how the lives of people transition from one place to another. Transition from a lowly place to a higher place of some form. Maybe even a position of significance. We'll discover together that each person that we discuss and we talk about in this process is not necessarily going through a physical transition, but a spiritual one. There's a story behind what it is we actually see. The Lenten journey is not just a static picture. It's not just capturing something frozen in time, but the story of Lent shows for us something that is unfolding, something that demonstrates movement. Ultimately, Lent is just that, the unfolding of God's redeeming love for all of us. Today's story really captures our imagination of that rags to riches model, doesn't it? It captures for us the story of little Esther. Esther, this young little girl. Who would have thought that this little girl could have captured our imagination thousands of years later? In fact, this last year, I selected Esther to be my biblical mentor, something that I would encourage each of us to pursue. A biblical mentor is somebody that you select from Scripture to say, I'm going to invest time and energy to learn as much as I possibly can from this person's life. Study them. Look into how God was at work in their life, and then learn the lessons that they have to teach us. I chose Esther because of her strength, because of her courage in what would otherwise be an insignificant story. Our story opens with all the great pomp and circumstance that you could imagine. A festival lasting 180 days. King Xerxes obviously thought an awful lot of himself. 180-day party. I go to anything for the evening and I need a nap. 180 days. To put this into perspective, Mardi Gras lasts 40 days. That's like 100 times more. Not 100, don't do the math. But Mardi Gras is this section of time where you see people from all over coming together for this intense time. And Xerxes says, I want 180 days of this to celebrate, how amazing I am. The king concluded this half-year festival with a week-long party in the own palace and says, I want everybody who's important, all the who's who, the red carpet, the paparazzi, I want everybody there. And he thinks to himself, how can I culminate even this amazing evening? I know. I'll have my wife, Queen Vashti, come out. She can walk around and show everybody how beautiful she is, and everybody will be envious of me. Go get Queen Vashti. Have her do that walk parade thing. He calls for her, and she doesn't come. She doesn't do what he wants to do, and so he is counseled by people to send her into exile. No king worth his weight could possibly have a queen that doesn't do every beck and whim that he wants. This will be a snowball effect, king. You don't want that. People will talk about you. At the height of your party, look at this. So if you're wondering, is the king a jerk? The answer is an overwhelming yes. If you're wondering to yourself, is he gullible? The answer is an overwhelming yes. In 2:8 we hear this. The king's order and edict has been proclaimed. Many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa to be put under the care of Haggai. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and trusted to Haggai, who was in charge of the harem, and she pleased him and won his favor. It's an interesting tale. If you're thinking of stories that you've read or watched on TV or seen in the movies, probably things are starting to come into picture. We have this evil sort of a king who's also sort of a dolt, who's being played by somebody else, manipulated. all these people that we fall in love with, the little guys, being twisted and forced to do things they don't want to do. So who do you see when you look at this story? Who do you focus on? King Xerxes, king of the Persian Empire in 486 BC? Powerful man. I'm sure he wore some pretty elaborate purple robes. Who do you look at? Who do you associate with? Do you see Queen Vashti standing up for herself? I am not a pawn in this story. And because of her courage and strength, she is exiled. Do you see Haggai? Oft in the wings, managing things, orchestrating stuff. Seems like a fairly decent individual. Perhaps you associate or see Haman, right? Who is he in this story? He's this evil person sort of plotting and doing all the stuff in the behind-the-scenes things and working as this little voice in the king's ear. Mordecai, the gentle uncle, or do you see Esther? Who is Esther? Esther is a young girl. Young girl who finds herself in the ruin of the Babylonian exile over here in Persia, thousands of miles away from where her family originated. Her parents die, and then so Mordecai, her cousin and or uncle, we're a little unclear on what that looks like, says, I will raise this little girl as my own. 15 years old. Out of her culture, out of her comfort zone, an orphan and a woman in a culture and community that does not value that. She is displaced. And so how does this story unfold for you? Is it a drama? Is it a crime show? It's certainly not a sitcom. We love our TV, don't we? It's fascinating, and we see how TV shapes and sort of even mirrors where we are as a society. In the 1980s, what kind of shows were popular? A-Team. I watched A-Team. A-Team, MacGyver, even Miami Vice. And then things changed a bit. The A-Team and MacGyver and Miami Vice were all about doing what the impossible could do, these people against the world, looking out for the small guy. In the 1990s, we wanted something a little bit more funny. People wanted to cling to hope, and they were looking for something a little bit more silly, and things that were popular were like Cheers, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and even Friends. The 2000s, we saw things shift again, and our attention was moved towards reality TV. We saw shows like Big Brother come out, and even The Bachelor. Who watched The Bachelor? Oh, come on, be honest. We're in church. I should see some hands. All waiting for that rose to be handed out at the end of the show. Who's going to get the rose? It's interesting because at this very same time, some other shows started to appear in our culture. Shows focused on extreme makeover. Extreme Home Edition, Extreme Home Makeover showed us this powerful story, this powerful new story of coming into a house out of nowhere, taking a family that was down on its luck and putting them on a trip someplace to some extravagant, who knows where, kind of lush tropical place for a week, while a whole team descended on their home that was sort of in ruin. We had the quirky guy come out. What was his name? Ty Pennington. tall, good-looking, funny. I get confused for him all the time. He would come in with his staff, right? And they'd plan, and they'd design, they'd orchestrate things. They'd knock down walls, they'd tear out things, they'd push the whole roof up. It was crazy what they would do. You'd watch this show as they took this house from sort of falling apart, this dilapidated place. And then, like within a week, it was this beautiful home. I couldn't imagine how many hundreds of hours of work and skill was put into doing something like that. And it would culminate with this moment where Ty would come out with the family who had just gotten back from this wonderful trip, and they'd stand in front, and what was right in front of the house? A bus. And what's that famous line that Ty would say? Driver, move that bus. The big reveal. Prior to 2002, the word extreme and makeover doesn't appear in any TV shows. After 2003, the words extreme and makeover appear in over 100 different show titles. This becomes an incredible cultural shift for us as we focus so much on this miraculous transformation. What does something look like? Show me what it looked like before, and show me what it looks like now. They'd pan in with their zooms and their long lenses and show you a countertop, what it looked like before with the formica, and all of a sudden it's this beautiful marble counter. The light glistening on it and a giant bowl of fresh fruit. They'd pan slowly through the backyard and show you what it looked like before. No grass, dirt, a random chair. And here's this beautiful outdoor seating area with a fire pit, fresh throw pillows, and comfy chairs. Culturally, we continue to be placed an incredible value on what can be seen. Magazines, movies, TV shows, newspapers, everything continues to barrage us with images. This is how it's supposed to look. This is what you want. This is what life is like for the person down the street, but you can have it too. Most of them are false images, illusions, fabrications, merely hinting at how things could be. We're naturally skeptical creatures, so we're always relying on our vision. I want to see what is going on. If I can't see it, it's not real. Even doubting Thomas gets in on the game of seeing as believing, doesn't he? We have seen the Lord, but he says what? Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger in the side of him, I will not believe. So what do you see in the story of Esther? Perhaps you see Haman and think of him as one of the bad guys from the old Western movies with a big black hat and silver spurs. It's interesting because Haman's name is mentioned 42 times in the book. He gets a lot of airtime, doesn't he? Esther comes in next, this orphan girl, this modest life history, and she's transformed into the queen of all of Persia. And yet her name only appears 49 times. Perhaps you look at the story and you see yourself associating with Mordecai. Here's this gentle uncle, this wise figure who posits himself just off to the side to help the whole story move along. His name is mentioned 56 times. Maybe you can't help focusing on the king. King Xerxes, the powerful figure in the story who commands all of Persia. Maybe you're wondering if he's this angry tyrant stomping through the courtyards. I wouldn't doubt it. His name is mentioned 192 times in the text. Haman, the evil sort of whodunit butler figure hanging off to the sides. Everybody gets mentioned. You know whose name does not appear in the credits as they roll by at the end of the film? God. God's name does not appear even once in the book of Esther. Reference is made to the kingdom of God. References are made to the religion that the Jews pursue following God. But the name Yahweh and God actually don't appear in the book of Esther. If we use our cultural lenses, we only believe what we see, and you don't see God's name. What are we left with? We may be tempted to think that it was simply an unfortunate tale of Esther's folks passing away. It was a random act of Mordecai becoming her uncle. It was a fluke that Esther happened to be of the right age to be the next queen. Maybe you were tempted to see it as a sheer accident that she was actually even selected to be part of the process, that she was then even selected to be the next queen. All completely random. These things have to be accidental, don't they? If they were intentionally coordinated by God, wouldn't we see his name all over the story? This is key for us to hear in the story today. The absence of God's name does not equal the absence of God. God was there when Esther's parents passed away and put Mordecai into her life. God was there when the king searched for a new queen and positioned Esther to be noticed. God was at work in Mordecai and moved him throughout the court, listening to the worshipers and advising Esther and advising the king's counsel. God was at work in Esther, preparing her to have the immense courage necessary for that one special moment, that moment that changed the entire course of the Jewish people. The absence of God's name does not equal the absence of God. So what do you see in your life this morning? What do you see as you look over your life and how it continues to unfold? The places you've been, the things that have happened. What sticks out to you as you look over your life? Do you see hardship? Do you see celebration? Do you see joy? What instances stick out? Is God's name written next to it? If it's not, are you puzzled over his absence? Are you pleased with how things have turned out? Are you at peace with the state of affairs, or do you wish that God played a bigger role? The real question as we look at our life as it unfolds is, what are you choosing to focus on? Remember, the absence of God's name does not equal the absence of God himself. Are you looking for God's Spirit at work in your life? Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he writes this, I pray also that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened, in order that you may know the hope to which he has called you. The actual words in there, know, that Paul refers to, is to be fully immersed in the knowledge of something, to fully understand and comprehend something, to fully comprehend God's presence in your life. God's plan is that you will fully understand the hope of your calling, to fully understand who He is in your life and to respond. Jesus suggests to Nicodemus that the Spirit is like the wind. You don't know where it is. You don't know where it comes from. I love that imagery because if there are two people standing outside and one person chose not to believe in the wind, he would have a very different view of the trees around him, wouldn't he? A person who said to himself, I am not going to believe that the wind exists. Looking out at the forest, he would see those trees pushing one way or the next. And his conclusion would be, boy, those are funny trees. It seems so unusual that they would choose to lean willy-nilly left and right. And yet the person standing next to them who chooses to believe that wind actually exists, that the wind is always playing in and out of the trees, could simply look at the very same picture and see those trees are being pushed back and forth and dance because of the effect of the wind. The wind always at work. The person who learns to observe with spirit eyes will look at the world and their life around them much differently than the person who believes that all I can see is all there is. And so the king set a royal crown on her head and made her queen, and the king gave her a great banquet. Esther's story begins as this young orphan girl, and it unfolds as she becomes queen of all of Persia. She's poised to save an entire generation of Jews. God orchestrates for us a beautiful story of redemption. From the very beginning, He hovered over the waters and He's been at work. He moved through His people and brought them out of slavery and moved them into Egypt. He spoke to people in the desert. He's placed His hand on our lives. He offered us His Son and set His Spirit at work in the world. God is at work. And what is God's plan? It's the same as it's always been. To redeem our relationship with Him. God's desire has been the same from the very first day till now, that we have a rich and deep relationship with Him. His redeeming hands can be seen everywhere if we look for them. The message of Lent is a compression of life itself, a movement from dark and lonely places to a place of light. It's a process that sometimes can feel unseen. It feels secretive, it feels hidden. And to comfort us, Jesus reminds us, my Father is always at work, and so am I. It's a matter of how you see the wind in the trees. Do you believe it? brothers and